As the rain pounded against the windows, an eerie silence filled the air, broken only by a distant flash of light that seemed to defy the storm. What if the answers to humanity's greatest mysteries had always been just above us, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? The rain tapped softly against the window, its rhythm a steady companion to the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rumbles of thunder far off in the distance. Outside, the storm rolled across the sky, flashing lightning for mere moments before everything returned to shadowed stillness. It was the perfect kind of evening for staying in, tucked away from the world, and drifting into the peaceful embrace of sleep. But for one woman, it was anything but peaceful. Lena had always been intrigued by the idea of UFOs. It wasn't that she had any particular belief in aliens, but the stories fascinated her. The thought that the universe, with all its vastness, could hold secrets beyond human comprehension lingered in her mind, especially on nights like this. As the storm intensified, so did the strange sensation of something being just beyond reach. Her eyes fluttered, heavy with the lure of sleep, when a bright flash of light pierced through the curtains, casting an eerie glow across the room. Lena sat up, heart racing. It wasn't lightning, that much was clear. The light was too focused, too deliberate. She stood and moved to the window, peering into the darkness of the night. The rain continued to fall, thick and heavy. But there, in the distance, a strange object hovered silently above the treetops. It was far enough to seem almost unreal, but close enough that its presence felt tangible, undeniable. For a moment, Lena felt frozen, her breath held in disbelief. The shape was unmistakable, a craft, sleek and angular, with lights pulsing in a pattern she couldn't recognize. The steady hum of the storm was replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to resonate from the object itself. She blinked, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her, but when she looked again, the craft was gone. Panic surged through her chest, and her mind raced. Could it have been a trick of the light? A reflection? Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far stranger was unfolding. Her heart hammered in her chest as she moved to the door, her hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. The outside world was drenched, and the rain had become torrential. Yet the darkness beyond held an unnerving stillness. Lena stepped outside, the cool rain hitting her skin in sharp, cold bursts. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and something else, something faintly metallic. The storm seemed to have stopped for a brief moment. She looked up, but there was nothing. Only the stars peeking through the clouded veil, distant and silent. Just as she began to doubt herself, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Another flash, brighter this time, right above her head. A soft hum filled the air once more. This time, there was no mistaking it. The lights blinked in rhythmic precision, and the craft seemed to descend toward her. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world around her seemed to pause. The rain, the hum, the light, it was all too real, too strange, too close. The storm had rolled in thick and fast, clouds swirling in the night sky, pregnant with the promise of rain and thunder. Sam, a local farmer, had just finished up his evening chores. He walked down the narrow dirt road that wound through his property, the smell of wet earth mixing with the damp scent of fresh hay. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, and with it came the unmistakable hum of the approaching storm. As he reached the edge of the field, Sam glanced up at the sky, watching the jagged streaks of lightning split the air. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, the sound growing louder with each passing moment. The storm was closer now, but still, he couldn't shake the sense that something else was out there. The air felt too still, too quiet between the bursts of thunder, as though the very world was holding its breath. It was then, in the brief moment between two flashes of lightning, that Sam noticed the lights. At first, he thought they were just reflections of the storm, or perhaps a trick of the weather. but something about the way they moved caught his attention. Bright, almost unnatural, the lights hovered just above the tree line, their patterns erratic, yet purposeful, as though they were darting back and forth in the sky. Weaving through the dark clouds, Sam's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him it was nothing, a misinterpretation, a flash of light bouncing off the low-hanging clouds. But he couldn't look away. As the rain began to fall, heavy and cold, the lights didn't dissipate. They hovered, steady and unwavering, blinking in unison. Then, just as his eyes widened in disbelief, one of the lights shot upward, disappearing into the clouds with a speed that left his mind racing. He stopped dead in his tracks, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air felt charged, filled with a strange energy. Sam's first thought was that perhaps it was some sort of military aircraft, a test flight, or something caught in the storm. But nothing in his years of farm life had ever explained the way the lights darted, how they changed direction so suddenly, or how they moved with such precision. For a moment, Sam stood frozen, rain pelting his face, unsure whether he should turn and run back to the house or stay and watch, as if the very sight of it might disappear if he looked away. Another flicker caught his eye, a series of rapid movements, each one more erratic than the last. The lights began to drift closer, still darting in and out of the clouds, as if they were drawn to him. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His chest tightened as a low, unsettling hum filled the air. Whatever these lights were, whatever they were doing, he was no longer convinced it was just a trick of the weather. The steady hum of the airplane engines was the only sound that filled the cockpit as Captain Robert Hayes flew through the storm. The rain lashed against the windows, the heavy drops rattling like tiny fists against the glass. He'd been flying for over 30 years, and the turbulence that came with storms like this had become nothing more than a slight inconvenience to him. He had seen it all, every kind of weather, every kind of emergency, and yet this storm felt different, more intense, more alive. Hayes adjusted the controls, keeping the plane steady as the wind howled around them. The storm clouds swirled in shades of gray and black, filling the sky with an ominous weight. As he peered through the cockpit window, the rain seemed to blur the horizon, reducing visibility to near zero. His co-pilot, a young man by the name of Daniels, kept his focus on the instruments, occasionally glancing up to check on the conditions outside. "Looks like we've got some real turbulence ahead," Daniels muttered, his voice thick with concentration. Hayes nodded but didn't respond. He had flown through worse. The storm wasn't going to be an issue. At least, it shouldn't have been. Then, just as he was about to adjust the altitude, something caught his eye, a flicker of light, a glow in the distance. It was brief at first, almost like a flash of lightning, but there was no thunder. A strange unease settled in his stomach as the light grew brighter, larger, moving against the wind rather than with it. He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the glow didn't fade. It pulsed, steady and strong, growing in intensity with every second. "Daniels," Hayes said, his voice low, almost cautious. "Do you see that?" Daniels didn't even look up from his gauges, but Hayes could hear the slight tremor in his voice as he said, "I'm seeing it. What the hell is that?" The light was moving closer now, too fast to be anything natural. It zigzagged through the sky, darting in a way that defied every law of aerodynamics Hayes knew. It was too quick, too erratic. For a moment, the only thought that crossed his mind was that it might be a malfunctioning military aircraft, perhaps a new, experimental model. But no aircraft could maneuver like that. No lights could glow with that unnatural hue. Hayes fought the urge to pull the plane away, to fly in the opposite direction, but something inside him told him not to. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the strange light, which now seemed to be coming directly toward them. For a long, terrifying moment, it hovered just outside their path, suspended in midair. Then, without any warning, it shot straight up, vanishing into the storm clouds above with a speed that made Hayes's heart race. The turbulence intensified immediately, shaking the plane violently. But Hayes knew it wasn't the storm. "Jesus," Daniels whispered, the color draining from his face. "What was that?" Hayes didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He had seen things that didn't belong in the sky, things he couldn't explain, but had never dared to speak of again. Until now. The rain fell in sheets, a relentless downpour that blurred the headlights of the car as Sarah and Mark drove through the winding mountain road. The night had been peaceful up until that point, a quiet drive back from a weekend getaway, the world outside wrapped in a thick veil of mist and darkness. But now, the storm had taken a turn for the worse, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the torrent that hammered the glass. "Should we pull over?" Mark asked, squinting through the murky darkness ahead. The road had become slick, treacherous with every curve, but there was nowhere to stop, just trees, mountains, and the occasional flicker of distant headlights. "No," Sarah replied, gripping the armrest, her eyes scanning the road. "We'll be fine. We're almost home." But something in the air had shifted. The storm wasn't just a storm anymore. It was as if the entire atmosphere had become heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up as she glanced out the window, her eyes catching a strange flicker in the sky above the trees. At first, she thought it was just lightning until the lights danced. Not like lightning, but with a deliberate, unnatural rhythm. They seemed to hover, flashing in a pattern, weaving through the clouds as if they were following the car. "Mark, do you see that?" Sarah's voice was shaky, a knot of unease growing in her stomach. Mark didn't answer right away, but his grip on the wheel tightened. The lights were getting closer now, darting back and forth, faster than any aircraft should have moved. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, slowing the car instinctively. He looked up at the sky, the eerie lights pulsing brighter, almost calling them. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The world seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, the car's engine, all gone. A sudden crushing silence enveloped them, and the car was no longer moving. The lights, now blinding, surrounded them, casting everything in a surreal glow. Mark slammed on the brakes, his breath caught in his chest as the world outside the car seemed to stretch and warp. "Mark, what's happening?" Sarah screamed, but her voice was muffled, drowned out by the strange hum that filled the car. She reached for him, her fingers trembling. Before they could process what was happening, a force like nothing they'd ever felt before gripped them. The car lifted, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, as if it was weightless. Sarah's heart raced as she felt her body being pulled from her seat, as though gravity itself was losing its hold. She looked at Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no time to say anything more. The lights intensified, and then, in an instant, everything around them went dark. The car, the road, the rain, everything disappeared. They were no longer on Earth. They were somewhere else entirely, and they had no idea why or how. The rainstorm outside was the last thing Sarah remembered before everything went quiet. The rest was an unspoken mystery that neither of them would ever fully understand. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, tapping against the canopy of trees as Jake, Maria, Liam, and Sarah sat huddled around a small campfire. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nature, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, and the gentle rhythm of rain. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just the four of them, far from the noise and distractions of city life. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, something that neither of them could quite place. The sky was mostly overcast, thick gray clouds swirling above, but it wasn't the weather that unsettled them. It was the stories. The old man at the nearby store had mentioned strange things happening in these woods, things no one could explain, lights, sounds, shadows moving where there should be none. Of course, they had laughed it off. After all, it was just a stormy night, a quiet place to relax. But as the hours passed, and the fire crackled low, An odd feeling lingered. What if he wasn't just talking nonsense? Maria asked softly, her eyes flicking nervously toward the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. What if something is out here? Don't start that, Jake replied, his voice laced with a half-hearted laugh. You're letting those stories get to you. It's just a storm. But Maria wasn't convinced. Neither were the others. The air felt thick, almost charged, like the atmosphere itself was waiting for something to happen. They fell silent, each of them aware of the sounds around them growing muffled under the weight of the rain. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, making the flames dance wildly, casting strange shadows over the campsite. Then, there was a noise, a low hum. It didn't belong to the wind, nor the rustling of the trees. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them, vibrating in their bones. It grew louder for a moment, then stopped. The fire flickered, casting its last few embers before settling into darkness. What the hell was that? Liam's voice trembled, his eyes darting nervously. Jake stood up, his gaze scanning the surrounding forest. It's nothing, just the wind, maybe. There's no... Suddenly, a bright light pierced the sky, cutting through the clouds in a sharp, steady beam. It wasn't lightning too controlled, too precise. The light seemed to pulse, moving slowly across the sky, like it was searching for something below. The friends stood frozen, not speaking, not moving. They watched as the light shifted direction, seemingly aware of their presence, as if it had been drawn to them. It hovered for a moment, casting an eerie glow on the trees, then shot upwards, disappearing into the clouds, leaving only the sound of rain against their faces. The forest fell silent. The hum was gone. The air, once thick with tension, now felt empty, hollow. I knew it, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. We weren't supposed to be here. None of them said anything after that. They couldn't. Whatever they had just witnessed, whatever had just passed through the sky wasn't something they could explain, not with words, not with science, and certainly not with laughter. The fire burned out, and the rain continued to fall, masking the whispers that were still, somehow, in the air. The rain came down in sheets, drenching the quiet town of Whispering Pines. It wasn't the kind of storm that rattled windows or shook the earth, but the heavy downpour created an eerie stillness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a scent of wet earth and something unfamiliar. The town had always been quiet, tucked away in a corner of nowhere, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. Yet, in the last few months, something had changed. The people of Whispering Pines had grown used to strange sightings in the sky. Odd lights, shapes darting through the clouds, and unexplained flashes, things that didn't belong in their small town. Tonight, though, something felt different. Harold, the town's unofficial historian, stood on his porch, watching the rain smear across the streetlights. His house, just on the edge of the town square, had a perfect view of the open field beyond. It was there, just a few nights ago, that he'd seen something, a flash of blue light that hovered for a moment before darting across the horizon. Tonight, he wasn't sure what he expected, but something told him the answer was coming. Inside, the town's residents gathered in the old diner, sheltering from the storm. Linda, the waitress, wiped down the counter absent-mindedly, her eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds. It feels different tonight, doesn't it? She asked quietly, leaning toward Tom, the town sheriff, who was nursing a cup of coffee in the corner booth. Yeah, he replied, his gaze fixed out the window. Too quiet. It's like the air itself is waiting for something. As the storm raged on, the diner's doors swung open. A figure, drenched to the bone, stepped inside. It was Harold. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an expression the town had never seen from him before. He didn't speak immediately but stood in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he had just run a marathon. I saw it again, he said, his voice hoarse. In the field. This time, it was different. Everyone in the diner fell silent, listening intently. Harold rarely talked about the sightings, always dismissing them as tricks of the light or his imagination. But tonight, there was something in his tone that made them all pause. It didn't move like before, Harold continued, stepping further into the room. It hovered, and then they came down. They weren't like us. Their faces, I couldn't make them out, but they were there. I know it. A chill ran through the room, despite the warmth of the diner. Linda, her hand shaking slightly, reached for the phone, but Tom stopped her. "No one's going to believe us, not after all these years," he said, shaking his head. "But we've all seen it, seen them. Those visitors." The room was still, save for the sound of the rain outside, pounding against the roof. They all knew, deep down, that whatever it was, whatever had come to their quiet town, had no explanation. The lights, the strange figures, and the unspoken understanding between them all that something larger was at play. Linda's voice broke the silence. "What do we do now?" No one had an answer. All they could do was wait for the rain to stop, and for the strange visitors to return. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the windows of the small study where Dr. Amelia Carter worked late into the night. She had always preferred the solitude of these late hours, the world outside forgotten, her focus sharp on the mysteries of the past. Tonight, however, her research felt different, almost as if the storm itself had ushered her towards something she wasn't prepared for. Amelia had been studying ancient texts and artifacts for years, uncovering lost civilizations and forgotten histories, but it was the artifact she had found that afternoon in a dusty corner of a private collection that intrigued her the most. An intricately carved stone tablet, worn by time but still holding an unmistakable energy. It depicted strange symbols, not from any known language, and figures unlike any humans she had ever seen. The markings seemed to pulse in the dim light of her study, almost as if they were alive, waiting to be understood. The rain hammered against the glass, a rhythmic pounding that set the stage for what was about to unfold. As Amelia examined the tablet more closely, a shiver crawled down her spine. The symbols, those alien-looking shapes, began to blur, shifting in her vision. Her fingers hovered over the carvings, and suddenly, she was no longer alone in the room. The walls seemed to dissolve, and the study vanished. In its place, she found herself standing in the middle of an ancient, desolate landscape, a sky swirling with strange clouds. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't place, an overwhelming feeling of something other. Before her stood towering figures, their forms vague and difficult to comprehend. They were humanoid, but their faces were not human, too angular, too sharp. Their eyes, large and dark, fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. The storm above them crackled with energy, not like the weather she knew, but something much more powerful, something that seemed to be coming from the very sky itself. Then, a voice, not in her ears but in her mind, echoed through her consciousness. "You have awakened us." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the words, feel them, but she didn't understand. Her body trembled, as if the visions she was witnessing were being channeled through her own being. The scene shifted again, faster this time, and she was swept into the past, a civilization, long forgotten, thriving under the watchful eyes of these visitors. The sky was alive with ships, crafts that moved in impossible ways, not bound by the laws of gravity. People, ancient and primitive in appearance, looked up in awe, their lives changed by the presence of these beings. The storm outside was growing louder, as if responding to the intensity of the visions. The strange energy surrounding the scene she was witnessing began to pulse, and Amelia realized that the artifact wasn't just a relic, it was a key, a link to a history that had been buried for millennia. Suddenly, the visions stopped. She gasped for air, her hand gripping the table, the room returning to its familiar form. The storm outside continued to rage, but the tablet before her now seemed almost alive, its symbols gleaming with an unspoken truth. Amelia knew, without a doubt, that what she had witnessed was real, that the ancient encounters had happened, and that this artifact was the evidence of a story long forgotten. She was just beginning to understand that the truth was far stranger than she could have ever imagined. The dense air of the rainforest pressed in around Jack as he trekked through the thick foliage, the rhythmic sounds of rainfall drumming against the canopy above him. He had been hiking for hours, alone, in search of the ancient ruins that were said to be hidden deep within the jungle. The rain had come on suddenly, as it often did in these parts, but Jack didn't mind. The rainforest, with its rich, earthy scent and the sense of timelessness, had always been a place of solace for him. The ground beneath his boots had become slippery, the trails more treacherous as the downpour intensified. Jack paused for a moment, wiping the rain from his brow and glancing at his watch. He was far from the nearest village, the only company the distant call of howler monkeys and the endless pitter-patter of rain. The air was thick, charged with energy almost electric. Suddenly, as he pushed forward, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the rain, the mist rising from the forest floor. But then, the glow became unmistakable. A soft, pulsing light, far too bright to be from any natural source. His heart skipped a beat as he squinted into the haze, the light cutting through the heavy rain like a beacon. It wasn't coming from any human-made structure or machinery. This light was otherworldly. He instinctively took a step closer, drawn toward the glow, curiosity pulling him like a magnetic force. The rain had begun to soften, though the humidity hung in the air like a thick blanket. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the usual chorus of animal sounds stilled in the face of whatever was unfolding before him. There, breaking through the thick mist and rain, emerged the shape of a craft. It was hovering just above the wet ground, its smooth, metallic surface reflecting the glimmering light of the nearby glow. The craft was unlike anything Jack had ever seen, a sleek, oblong form, pulsing softly with light in a pattern that seemed too intentional to be natural. He could feel the energy in the air shift, like the very fabric of reality was bending around the object. Jack stood frozen, heart racing, as the craft emitted a low hum that vibrated in the air. It hovered effortlessly, almost as if it were weightless, the mist swirling around its base as the rain seemed to part around it. The craft's surface shimmered in the rain, its design sleek and unfamiliar, casting a glow over the wet terrain that made everything feel surreal, dreamlike. He didn't know how long he stood there, captivated by the sight before him. His mind screamed to run, to escape the strangeness unfolding before him, but his feet were rooted to the spot. As quickly as it had appeared, the craft began to rise, lifting gently into the misty sky, disappearing as silently as it had come. The forest returned to its quiet state, the rain resuming its constant rhythm. Jack stood there for a moment longer, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The pulse of the craft, the strange hum, the glow, it was all too real, too vivid to be a figment of his imagination. He knew, without a doubt, that what he had seen in the heart of the rainforest that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. The evening had started quietly. The family gathered on the porch as the rain fell softly around them, the rhythmic patter of drops on the roof providing a comforting soundtrack. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and the distant rumble of thunder seemed to echo across the valley. Mary wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, her two children, Emma and Lucas, curled up beside her as they watched the darkened sky. The storm was like any other, their small town used to the frequent showers that came rolling down from the mountains. But tonight, something felt different. The clouds above were thick, almost oppressive, with the promise of a heavy downpour. Yet, for some reason, the sky seemed to hum with a kind of energy that neither Mary nor her children could place. It wasn't just the low rumble of thunder. There was something more, a subtle vibration in the air that made the hairs on their arms stand up. Mary felt it too, a strange sense of anticipation that made her glance nervously at the dark horizon. Then, without warning, the storm exploded into something altogether unexpected. The first lightning strike lit up the sky, but it wasn't just a flash of white. It was bright, almost painfully so, and as it arced across the sky, it was joined by streaks of color, vivid blues, greens, and purples. Emma gasped, her wide eyes reflecting the strange display, while Lucas clutched his mother's arm, both of them watching in stunned silence. The sky was alive, not with the usual jagged bolts of lightning, but with something far more intricate and beautiful. The colors danced and pulsed, each burst brighter and more surreal than the last. Mary could hardly believe what she was seeing. It wasn't just lightning. The flashes seemed too deliberate, too structured, as though the storm itself had become a stage for something else. The colors swirled, forming patterns in the sky that reminded her of the northern lights, but so much closer, so much more intense. The electric hum in the air grew louder, almost as if the atmosphere itself was charged with energy that had nowhere to go but through the sky. For what seemed like an eternity, the family watched in awe as the sky put on its extraordinary light show, each burst of color flashing faster and more intensely than any natural storm should allow. The rain fell harder now, but the lights above were so mesmerizing, it felt as if time itself had slowed. The flashes of neon light twisted and twirled, weaving intricate shapes and arcs that no earthly storm could produce. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light show stopped. The sky returned to its normal, dark, stormy self, the rain pattering steadily once again, as if the spectacle had never happened. The distant rumble of thunder seemed to carry a lingering echo, as if the world was holding its breath in the aftermath of something remarkable. Mary, Emma, and Lucas sat in silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Whatever it was, they knew one thing for sure: it wasn't just a storm. And in the stillness that followed, they couldn't help but feel that something extraordinary had just visited their quiet corner of the world. The rain poured down in torrents as the small team of UFO investigators huddled beneath their tarps, the thunderstorm raging around them. The night had settled in thick and heavy, the clouds low and swirling with electricity, and the crackle of thunder rolled across the sky in waves. The team had spent months preparing for this night, driven by reports of strange lights and anomalous activity that seemed to coincide with the fiercest storms. Tonight, they were determined to document whatever might be lurking above. Their equipment, a mix of high-tech sensors and simple listening devices, sat in a circle around them. The rain made it difficult to hear anything but the heavy drumming on the tarps, but the team was ready. Their leader, Mark, adjusted the frequency on the handheld receiver, hoping to catch something unusual. "Keep your eyes on the sky," he said, voice steady, though his nerves were taut. "If there's anything up there tonight, we'll find it." The team members nodded, scanning the dark clouds, their eyes straining through the sheets of rain. They'd been here before, different locations, different storms, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with something that couldn't be easily explained. The rain didn't just feel like water. It felt charged, alive in some way. Mark's colleague, Sarah, glanced at her instrument, which had started picking up strange, rhythmic static. "Mark," she called softly, her voice tense. "I'm getting something. It's not normal." Mark quickly moved to her side, looking at the screen as the receiver crackled with an odd, repeating frequency, almost like a hum beneath the storm. The static seemed to pulse, almost as though it were responding to the thunder, but the patterns were too precise to be natural. Sarah adjusted the dial, but it didn't stop. Instead, the hum deepened, becoming almost melodic, like a song woven into the storm itself. "What is that?" whispered Daniel, another investigator, his eyes wide as he looked to the sky. The storm above them was shifting, the dark clouds rolling as though stirred by an unseen hand. The air grew heavier, colder, and a chill ran through the group as the frequency began to change. The melody that had been faintly buzzing in their ears now resonated deeper, louder. It was like the sky itself had become an instrument, playing a song only they could hear. Then, without warning, the storm seemed to pause. The wind stilled, and the thunder quieted. The rain fell softer. The only sound left was the eerie hum in the air. The team stood frozen, the realization dawning on them that whatever had caused the strange frequencies, it wasn't from Earth. Suddenly, a bright light flared in the distance, cutting through the clouds, followed by another, then a third. Each one moved in a pattern that defied all explanation, darting and weaving like something alive. Mark's heart raced, his voice barely a whisper. He spoke into the radio. "It's them. We found them." In that moment, the storm, the static, and the unexplainable lights merged into something they would never forget, a perfect storm of encounters and the evidence they had been seeking all along. The rain hammered against the windows of the small meeting room, the steady drumming filling the air as the astronauts sat in a chair, their hands shaking slightly as they looked out into the storm. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clap of thunder, but inside, the weight of their words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the gravity of the secret they had carried for so long. "I didn't believe it at first," the astronaut said, their voice quiet but steady. "You don't when you're trained for something like this. You prepare for space, for the unknown, but never for something like that." The team of investigators sat in silence, listening intently, knowing that this was a story that would change everything. The astronaut, once part of an elite space program, had spent years in orbit, circling Earth, watching the planet below. But it wasn't until their final mission, when they were coming back from the farthest reaches of space, that they had encountered something that defied explanation. "It was during a storm," the astronaut continued, their eyes distant as if replaying the events in their mind. "We were re-entering Earth's atmosphere when the ship suddenly shook violently. I thought it was just turbulence, some anomaly in the re-entry process. But then I saw it. A ship, a massive one. It appeared out of nowhere, like it was waiting for us." The astronaut paused, taking a slow breath. "At first, I thought it was a glitch in the system, something to do with the equipment. But no, it wasn't. It was real. The ship was hovering just above us, silent. No sound, no heat signature. It moved with precision, almost as if it was alive. The room was still, save for the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. We tried to communicate," the astronaut said, their voice tinged with a memory that still sent a shiver down their spine. "We sent out a distress signal, hoping for a response, but they didn't respond like we expected. Instead, the communication came in bursts of light pulses, like a pattern. It wasn't words, not in any way we understood, but it felt significant, as if they were trying to show us something, not just talk to us." The astronaut's eyes darkened, the memory clearly still vivid. Then came the vision. In an instant, it wasn't just about the ship. It was about everything. A flood of images, of knowledge. I saw their world, their history, and their technology advanced beyond anything we could comprehend. They weren't hostile. They weren't even curious, not in the way we would think. It was like they were, observing, passing through, seeing if we were ready. But before I could understand what it all meant, they left, just as quietly as they had come. A long silence stretched between them, the storm outside only adding to the weight of the moment. "And what do you think it means?" one of the investigators asked, their voice hushed. The astronaut turned to face them, their expression serious. "I think it means we're not alone, and they've been watching for a long time." As the rain continued to fall, the astronaut's story hung in the air, a haunting reminder of the vastness beyond, and the unknown that lay waiting for humanity. The rain fell softly against the windows of the small beachside cabin, a constant rhythm that blended with the sound of the waves crashing onto the shore. Inside, an old man sat in a worn chair, the firelight flickering across his face as he gazed out toward the darkened horizon. The wind howled faintly outside, but inside, it was warm, comfortable, a place for memories to stir. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years, of experiences that seemed impossible to share. As the storm raged outside, the old man leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the distant sea. "It was the summer of '73, he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I was a young man then, just starting to make a life for myself by the water." He paused, as though searching for the right words, before continuing. "It was late in the evening, a storm brewing just off the coast. I was out on the pier, checking the boats, when I saw something strange on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a fishing trawler, the lights from it flickering in the distance. But as it got closer, I realized it wasn't a boat, not even close." The old man shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as if the memory stirred something inside him. The craft appeared from the horizon, low over the water. It moved without a sound, smooth, like it was gliding just above the surface. I could see the outline of it, large, shaped like nothing I had ever seen before. It was dark, metallic, but it had this glow about it, an eerie light that seemed to shift, like it was alive. He looked out the window again, his eyes narrowing as he relived the moment. Then it stopped, hovering right there over the water, just hovering, and that's when I saw the symbols, strange markings on the surface of the craft. They weren't like anything I had seen in books or in the stories people tell. They were circular, intricate, almost like a language. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt something deep in my bones, like I was meant to see it. The old man fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air, heavy like the storm outside. I don't know how long it stayed there. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch. But then, as quietly as it had come, the craft started to rise, slowly, silently, and before I could even blink, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the storm. I never saw it again, but I knew what I had seen. No one else believed me, but I know what I saw. The fire crackled softly as the old man leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. His gaze was distant, as if lost in that moment on the pier, where the unknown had brushed against his life, leaving behind a mystery that would never fully fade. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but inside, there was only the quiet echo of the sea, and the faint, lingering sense that something far greater than the storm had passed that night. The wind began to stir in the fields, pushing the tall cornstalks into restless waves as the storm approached. The sky was a bruise of dark clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the flat, open land. Beneath that heavy sky, two farmers stood side by side, watching the horizon as the first raindrops began to fall. Their weathered faces were etched with years of hard work, but tonight they would remember something that would forever haunt them. That night, one of the farmers, a man named Roy, began, his voice low, almost as if speaking the words would bring it all back too vividly. "We were out in the fields, just finishing up for the day. The storm was coming in, but it was still quiet, almost too quiet. We didn't think anything of it." He paused, staring into the flickering firelight before continuing. Then, all of a sudden, the air changed. His partner Bill nodded solemnly beside him. "Yeah, it felt like everything went still, like the wind was holding its breath, and then we saw it. At first, it looked like a star, just this little dot way up in the sky. But it wasn't moving like a plane or a helicopter. It was too steady." Roy rubbed his chin, trying to push the images away. We stood there watching it for a minute, and then, it started to get closer. It didn't make a sound. No engine noise. Nothing. I thought it was a trick of the light, but as it got closer, I knew it wasn't. it was something else. Bill's eyes went wide at the memory. It was huge. I swear, it was as big as a house, glowing a pale blue, and it hovered right over us, barely above the cornfield. I don't know how we didn't hear anything, but it was like time stopped. And then the lights. It just seemed to pulse. Not like lightning, but steady, almost like it was trying to talk to us. The rain had started to fall harder now, the sound of it on the roof mingling with the men's voices. Roy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but he didn't stop. Next thing we knew, we weren't standing there anymore. It's like we were pulled. 1 minute we were on the ground, and the next, he shuddered, his breath catching. We were inside that thing. Bill finished for him, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to explain it. The beings, they weren't like anything I've seen. Tall, thin, with eyes that seemed to glow. And the weirdest part? They didn't speak a word, but somehow, we knew what they were saying. It was like they were talking inside our heads, showing us images, feelings. And it wasn't just one thing. It was like they were telling us things we can't understand. Roy turned to Bill, his face pale. I still hear their voices sometimes, even now. They didn't hurt us, but I know they took something. They left us with things we can't forget, things we weren't meant to know. The two farmers fell silent, the only sound now the steady patter of rain on the roof. And in that quiet, it was clear they hadn't just witnessed a strange event. They had been changed by it, and whatever it was, it lingered, just beyond the edge of their understanding. The rain fell heavily, beating against the tents and making a soothing sound that seemed to blend with the distant rumbles of thunder. A father and his daughter sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, watching the storm unfold. Their small campsite, nestled in a clearing in the woods, felt secluded, a quiet haven away from the noise of the world. But tonight, the storm seemed to bring with it something far beyond what they could explain. It's a good thing we brought the extra tarp. The father, John, said, shifting the firewood around. Looks like it's going to keep raining for a while. His daughter, Emma, smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I like it though, she replied. The rain makes everything feel peaceful. The two of them sat together in the warm glow, occasionally talking about small things, family, stories from when she was younger. It was simple, comfortable, but then the world outside seemed to shift. A flash of lightning split the sky, lighting up the trees around them in an eerie, brief flash of white. But as the thunder rolled through the air, a strange silence fell. The wind stopped, and for a few moments, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. John's eyes narrowed as he looked up into the sky, unsure of what he had just seen. A streak of light, unlike any lightning he had ever witnessed, cut through the storm. It moved with a deliberate slowness, almost like it was in complete control of the weather around it. The light grew brighter, larger, until it seemed to fill the space between the trees. Dad, what is that? Emma's voice trembled as she pointed, her hand shaking slightly. John couldn't respond at first. The light flickered and swirled, not like a natural bolt of lightning, but more like an entity of its own. It moved, almost fluidly, in ways that made no sense. And then, as the thunder crashed overhead, the light revealed itself. It wasn't a lightning strike, not by any means. It was a craft, an enormous, gleaming disk hovering just above the treetops, its surface shifting with an unearthly glow. The edges of the craft seemed to ripple like liquid, bending the air around it. The sound of the rain grew distant, muffled by the sudden presence of this strange visitor. John's heart raced as he grasped Emma's hand tightly, instinctively pulling her close. Stay calm, Emma, he whispered, his voice strained. We're safe. It's just something we don't understand. The craft hovered for what felt like an eternity, as though studying them, before it began to move slowly across the sky, fading into the storm clouds as it disappeared from view. The rain picked up again, but the strange silence that had come with the craft's presence lingered, and neither father nor daughter could find words to fill the gap. As they sat together, watching the storm intensify once again, Emma leaned against her father. Her heart still raced, but there was a sense of comfort in the way they were together, the way they had shared that moment of the unknown. "I don't know what that was, but I'm glad you were here," she whispered, her voice steady now. John squeezed her hand and nodded, his mind still reeling. "Whatever it was, we'll face it together." The rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets against the isolated observatory perched on the edge of the mountain. Dr. Evelyn Mercer sat at her desk, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she tracked the latest weather patterns. It had been a quiet week. Too quiet, in fact. The usual fluctuations in temperature and pressure were there, but something was off. She had been monitoring these disturbances for months now, her attention always drawn to one particular anomaly. The way the weather seemed to behave differently during storms. The thunder, the lightning. It wasn't just the usual natural chaos. There was something deeper, something more controlled beneath the surface. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew something was there. Tonight, as the storm raged outside, the data came in. She had adjusted her instruments to pick up on subtle fluctuations, and this time, they were picking up more than just atmospheric changes. The readings were sharp, erratic, far beyond anything that could be explained by normal weather systems. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scrutinized the data. The numbers didn't add up. The disturbances seemed to follow a pattern, one that only appeared when the rainstorms intensified. The frequencies were too organized, too precise. It wasn't just static. It was as though something was intentionally generating the signals. Her heart quickened. She cross-referenced the readings with the rest of her data, and that's when she noticed it. Beneath the surface of the Earth, at a depth of over a mile, there was a dense concentration of energy. It was impossible to ignore. The data suggested something was buried deep in the ground, something powerful and alive. For a moment, Evelyn doubted her senses. She had been isolated up here for too long. Perhaps the storm had been playing tricks on her mind. But as the storm outside intensified, so did the readings. There was no denying it now. She couldn't ignore the truth. With trembling hands, she typed in a few commands and linked her findings to the satellite maps of the region. Her eyes widened as the satellite data confirmed what her instruments had suggested. The energy readings matched the coordinates of an ancient, long-forgotten structure buried beneath the Earth. The storm seemed to be pulling the energy to the surface, as if the weather was being manipulated by something deep underground. Evelyn's pulse raced. She had been working on weather phenomena for years, but this was something entirely new. There was no record of anything like this in the scientific community. She was staring at proof of alien technology, buried beneath the Earth, hidden in plain sight. As the storm roared outside, Evelyn felt the weight of the discovery settle in. It wasn't just weather patterns she was studying anymore, it was something far greater. Something that could change everything. She knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a mystery that no one was ready to unravel. The storm was only the first sign. The rain hammered against the cabin windows, a constant, rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo through the walls. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. 4 friends sat gathered around the table, their conversation drowned out by the relentless storm outside. But despite the chaos of nature, an eerie stillness seemed to fall over the small cabin. Megan was the first to notice it, something about the sky. She stood up from the table, her eyes drawn to the window. Outside, the rain fell in heavy sheets, but the sky seemed different. It wasn't the usual storm clouds, swirling and thundering in their usual fashion. Instead, there was a break, a strange, unnatural calmness where the clouds should have been. "Guys, look at this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. as if the moment itself required silence. The others stood up, peering over her shoulder. Through the misty blur of rain, they saw it, a shape dark, hovering in the sky. It was still, motionless, not a single movement, despite the howling wind and rain all around it. The UFO hovered in the distance, suspended as though defying both gravity and the furious storm that raged beneath it. But what struck them most was the silence. The rain, pounding hard against the trees and roof, was loud enough to drown out any other sound, but there, in the sky, not a whisper. It was unnerving, the absence of sound. They had all seen storms before, rainstorms, hailstorms, thunder, but never had they seen something like this. The UFO seemed to ignore the elements around it, floating with an eerie grace, unmoving. It wasn't like the flashing, darting lights of distant aircraft or the rumbling ships they had seen in the past. This was different, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Terry, the skeptic of the group, took a deep breath and shook his head. It's probably some kind of weather balloon, or a drone, or something. There's no way. But before he could finish his thought, the craft slowly began to move, still unnervingly silent. It drifted sideways, as if it was studying the cabin, before coming to an abrupt halt once again. The rain continued to beat down around it, but not a single drop seemed to fall near the UFO. It was as if the weather itself avoided the object, curving around it as though in fear. Megan's heart raced, and she felt a cold chill settle in her spine. There was no explanation for this, no rational thought that could clear away the growing fear in her chest. The others stood frozen, eyes locked on the unmoving object. Time seemed to stretch as the UFO hovered in place, completely ignoring the chaos below it. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the craft shot upward, disappearing into the storm clouds with a speed and grace that left no trace behind. The silence followed, lingering long after it was gone. The rain continued, unbroken, and the cabin felt suddenly too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. They didn't speak for a long time, the memory of the silent sky hanging between them, unanswered and unfinished. The storm clouds stretched endlessly ahead, dark and brooding. As Captain Stephen Miles adjusted the controls of his small private plane, the rain beat against the windshield, a steady percussion that seemed to blur the world outside. He had flown through countless storms in his career, but this one felt different. There was an unnerving stillness to the air, despite the heavy downpour, and the turbulence was unlike any he had ever experienced. He glanced at the radar. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual patchwork of storm cells scattered across the sky. Yet, something caught his eye, a flicker on the edge of his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light or a reflection from the dashboard, but then it happened again, this time closer. A light, brilliant, almost blinding in its intensity, cutting through the storm like a laser beam. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't like any aircraft he had ever seen. No blinking navigation lights, no familiar patterns. It was as if it existed outside the rules of aviation, and it was moving in a way that defied logic. He banked the plane slightly, attempting to steer clear, but the light followed. His hands tightened around the controls as the strange object began to draw closer, moving with an eerie precision that made his heart race. The UFO was no longer just a light in the distance. It was actively engaging with him, matching his speed, weaving through the clouds with almost supernatural grace. The rain intensified, pelting the aircraft with a ferocity that made it hard to focus. Yet, through the chaos, the UFO remained calm, its movements impossibly smooth. The object flashed, almost as if communicating, and then, without warning, it seemed to merge with the clouds around him, disappearing from view for a moment. He breathed out, trying to steady his nerves, when suddenly, the entire plane was rocked by a sudden force, as if the craft had been caught in the pull of something immense. The altitude indicator went haywire, spinning as the plane lurched in the sky. He gripped the controls, heart hammering in his chest. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the turbulence stopped. The plane stabilized, and in front of him, the clouds parted, revealing something astonishing. He was no longer flying through a storm. Instead, he found himself surrounded by a strange, alien landscape, an environment made of shapes and materials he could not comprehend, suspended in mid-air, far beyond anything man-made. His instruments were blank. The cockpit lights flickered erratically. For a moment, he had no idea where he was, or how he had gotten there. The UFO, now beside him, emitted a low hum, almost like a song, filling the cabin with a strange sense of calm. It was as if the storm itself had been a doorway, opening into another world, one that existed outside the boundaries of his understanding. Before he could process what had just happened, the craft slowly drifted away, leaving him alone in the now silent sky, the storm clouds slowly closing behind it, as if they had never been there at all. The rain began to fall once more, gentle and steady, leaving Captain Miles to wonder if the encounter had been real, or if he had simply flown too close to a world that no human was meant to see. The rain never stopped in Hollow Creek. It was a quiet, sleepy town where nothing much ever happened, where the world felt stuck between time's cracks. People went about their lives, the soft patter of rain on rooftops, a constant hum in the background. But recently, something had changed. Every evening, as the dark clouds rolled in and the rain soaked the streets, something else appeared strange, flickering lights in the sky. Elliot, a young man with a history of unusual encounters, had been watching the lights for days. He'd seen them before, in places far from home. Alien craft, they'd seemed hovering, pulsating, darting through the air in ways that no human technology could replicate. He'd once dismissed them as dreams or imagination, but now he knew better. He was certain these lights weren't just storms playing tricks. They were signals, a message. He spent his evenings tracking them, staring up into the rain-heavy sky, trying to make sense of the patterns. At first, it was a random flicker here and there, a sudden flash of light, and then darkness. But soon, Elliot began to notice a rhythm. The lights were not random at all. They blinked in sequences, too deliberate, too consistent. They were coming from above, and they were coming with purpose. One cold night, with the rain falling in sheets, Elliot decided to investigate further. He climbed to the highest point in town, an old hill just past the outskirts. From there, he could see the whole valley stretched out beneath the mist. The lights appeared again, this time more intense, hovering over the trees near the town's edge. Elliot's heart raced. He wasn't sure if they were trying to communicate with him or if they were simply observing. Either way, he felt a pull, an inexplicable connection that drew him toward them. Elliot had always been different. After his first encounter years ago, he'd been forever changed. Strange memories surfaced from those days, the sensation of being watched, the flashes of beings just out of sight. He'd told no one, thinking they wouldn't believe him. But tonight, as the rain began to pour harder, Elliot knew this was something bigger than just him. It was happening again, and this time, there was no denying it. He pulled out his old camera, shaky hands fumbling with the settings. As he focused on the lights, he caught them in a still frame, a perfect series of geometric patterns in the sky, brighter now, pulsing rhythmically. His breath caught. This wasn't just an encounter. It was a signal, one meant for more than him. It was for the entire town, perhaps the entire world, to hear. Elliot's pulse quickened, but as the lights grew stronger, he noticed something in the air, an odd hum, like the sky itself was vibrating. It was as if the entire atmosphere was alive, reverberating with energy. The world around him blurred. In the distance, the town lights flickered, momentarily dimming. The truth was clear now, as clear as the rain that poured from the heavens. This town, This quiet place that no one ever thought would matter was not just an observer of the world. It had become a beacon, a signal in the rain-soaked skies. And the answers Elliot sought, the ones that had always eluded him, were just beginning to unfold. The desert was still, the kind of stillness that felt like it had been there for centuries, untouched by the hustle of time. Far from any city or town, the archaeologist, Dr. Amanda Westbrook, had been combing the land for hours under the hot sun. But now, with night settling in and the familiar rumble of thunder in the distance, the weather shifted. Dark clouds began to blanket the sky, and the wind picked up, pushing dust across the arid ground. She found herself taking shelter near the remnants of what seemed to be an ancient ruin, a place few had ventured before. Her hands shook from excitement, not from the storm, as she carefully brushed away the sand that had gathered over the forgotten artifact. The shape of it was unusual, different from anything she had seen in her years of study. It was cylindrical, smooth, and metallic, unlike any object that belonged to Earth's ancient civilizations. The rain began to fall, soaking the ground, but it did little to stop her hands from working with fervor. She needed to know what it was, who it was from. As the first drops hit the surface of the artifact, a strange humming sound filled the air. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the storm's thunder, but then it grew louder. The sound was deep, vibrating the air around her. She leaned in closer, her breath steady despite the uncertainty that crept into her mind. The artifact was alive, the rain intensified, turning into a torrential downpour. It came down so hard that the earth beneath her feet began to shift, small rivers of water streaming across the ground. But Dr. Westbrook barely noticed. Her focus remained entirely on the object in her hands. The hum turned into a rhythmic pulsation, almost like a heartbeat, and she felt it in her chest. It wasn't just the storm that was coming alive now. The air felt electric, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Suddenly, a flash of light cut through the thick clouds, illuminating the sky above her. At first, she thought it was just a bolt of lightning, but then there was another flash, and another. The lights were moving, not like any storm or natural phenomenon she had ever witnessed. They were deliberately organized, sweeping across the sky in perfect, calculated patterns. Dr. Westbrook felt her heart race, her mind spinning. The artifact in her hands was humming louder, almost as if it was communicating with the lights. The lights in the sky swirled, circling above her like an unseen force was manipulating them. She held the artifact tighter, her fingers pressing into its smooth surface as the strange, otherworldly hum continued. The air around her felt thick, suffocating even, as if something was about to break through. And then, the hum stopped. The lights vanished into the night, and the rain fell again, calm, steady. But Dr. Westbrook knew that what she had just witnessed was not a coincidence. The artifact had connected with something beyond the stars, and as she looked up at the sky, a sense of eerie certainty settled over her. The answers she had been searching for were not buried in the ground. They were out there, waiting, and now she was part of the mystery. The storm came on suddenly, as storms often do in the mountains. One moment, the night was calm, and the next, the sky erupted with flashing lightning and heavy rain that pounded against the cabin windows. James Grant, the late-night radio host, sat comfortably in his usual chair, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, the familiar hum of the old equipment surrounding him. He was used to the solitude after all. The small cabin on the edge of the woods was perfect for his late-night shifts, far away from the noise of the city. He adjusted his headphones and settled into the rhythm of the show. His listeners, a scattered audience across the country, were mostly nocturnal types, the ones who thrived in the quiet hours when the world seemed to sleep. James had always enjoyed the late-night, intimate atmosphere of his broadcasts. It felt like he was speaking directly to each listener, sharing stories, music, and the occasional conspiracy theory. But tonight felt different. The storm outside seemed to press in on the little cabin, its winds howling against the walls and windows. The storm's intensity grew with each passing minute, drowning out the usual sound of his voice in the background. Then, just as James was about to introduce his next segment, the sound of static surged through the headphones, cutting through the airwaves with a sharp crackle. He paused, adjusting the dials, thinking it was just the weather causing some interference. But when the static didn't fade, he leaned closer to the console. His fingers danced over the knobs, trying to tune the signal back to its usual clear frequency. The static only grew louder, distorted and jarring, until it shifted into something strange, a voice. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, warped by the crackling interference, but unmistakably not of this world. The words were garbled, just out of reach of comprehension, but the cadence, the tone, was unmistakable. James's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the microphone, his pulse quickening. He had heard stories of strange signals, of odd radio waves picked up by others in isolated spots, but never had he thought he'd be part of one of these phenomena. He kept his hand on the control panel, trying to clear the static, but the voice came through again, this time clearer, as if it were speaking directly to him, to his station. The words were fragmented, alien in nature, and yet there was a clear message. They sounded like coordinates, like something someone was trying to reach him. The storm outside raged even harder now, as if feeding the growing energy in the air. The cabin walls seemed to hum, vibrating in response to the signal. And then, as quickly as it had started, the voice stopped, leaving only the rain and the wind in its wake. The signal returned to static, a buzzing emptiness that filled the room. James sat frozen, staring at the radio equipment in front of him, unsure of what had just happened. His show continued, but his mind raced, replaying the strange words he had heard. Was it a trick of the storm, or had he truly made contact with something beyond the stars? The rain fell steadily outside, but inside, the quiet felt heavy, as if the night was holding its breath, waiting for him to understand the message that had been sent. The rain was relentless, the kind that swept across the barren desert landscape in sheets, blurring everything in sight. Border Patrol agents, Dan and Jake, were on their usual midnight shift, parked in their truck on the outskirts of a small desert town. Their job was straightforward, keeping an eye on the quiet stretches of land, making sure no one crossed the border illegally. But tonight was different. Tonight, the storm seemed to have a mind of its own, as if nature itself was preparing for something strange. The radio crackled in the background, but neither of them paid much attention. They were used to the eerie silence that accompanied long shifts, the occasional sound of rain against the truck's windshield being their only company. But that night, there was a tension in the air, something they couldn't quite explain. Then, it happened. A flash of light, sudden and bright, shot through the rain-soaked sky. At first, it seemed like lightning, but there was something off about it, too controlled, too precise. It darted across the sky, faster than any aircraft they'd ever seen. The two agents stared, eyes wide, their breaths held in unison. The light zipped and spun, weaving in and out of the thick clouds, vanishing and reappearing in an almost playful manner. "Did you see that?" Dan's voice barely broke the silence. Jake didn't answer. His hand hovered over the radio, but he didn't know what to say. There were no words for this. They weren't supposed to be seeing things like this. The UFO, as they would later call it, hovered for a moment before darting away with incredible speed, heading in the direction of the distant mountains. Dan slammed his hand on the dashboard, trying to steady his racing heart. They both knew the protocol reported to headquarters, but they also knew the real protocol, the one that wasn't written down anywhere: keep quiet. But the rain kept falling, and the sky stayed alive with the strange, unearthly movements. Something about the way the craft moved, its fluidity, struck them both deep in their bones. They knew they were witnessing something far beyond their pay grade. What the hell was that? Jake finally managed, his voice a little shaky. Dan looked out into the storm. He didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense, but he had seen it too. The strange craft, the way it maneuvered through the storm, almost as if it were one with it, as if it was waiting for something or someone. The radio crackled again, this time with an unfamiliar voice. A voice neither agent recognized. "Keep your eyes on the skies, gentlemen. We're watching." Dan and Jake exchanged a look. They were still processing what they had just seen, but now, with that message, everything changed. Their shift would never be the same again. The rain continued to pour, but this time, the storm felt different. It wasn't just weather, it was a warning. Something was coming, and they were being pulled into a much larger story. The rain hammered against the roof, the kind of downpour that made everything outside feel distant and muffled. Inside their cozy home, Michael and Claire sat curled up on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across their faces. The storm had been raging for hours, but the couple barely noticed the time pass as they talked quietly, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Then, a sound broke through the rhythm of the rain. It was faint at first, almost like a hum, but it wasn't the usual creak of the house or the wind rustling the trees outside. It was different, almost mechanical. Michael looked up, brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Claire, who had been half dozing, sat up straighter, trying to catch the sound. The hum came again, sharper this time, followed by a faint metallic click. They both stood up, exchanging glances, their curiosity piqued. The rain had intensified, the rhythmic drumming on the windows now a constant roar. But the strange noise was still there, almost as if it was coming from the woods behind their house. Claire's heart started to race as her mind tried to make sense of the odd sounds in the distance. Without a word, Michael grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and the two of them quietly stepped outside, their feet crunching in the wet grass. The air was thick with moisture, and the scent of the storm filled their lungs as they made their way through the yard, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the heavy curtain of rain. They reached the edge of the woods, and that's when they saw it. At first, Claire thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection off the rain-soaked ground. But as the flashlight beam illuminated it more clearly, her breath caught in her throat. There, barely 100 feet away, sat an unmanned spacecraft. It was sleek and metallic, almost organic in shape, with a dull silver sheen that glistened under the light of the storm. No markings, no visible seams, just an eerie stillness that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. Michael was speechless for a moment, his eyes scanning the strange craft, unsure if he should believe what he was seeing. But there it was, unmistakable and real. The hum they'd been hearing now felt louder, but it was barely perceptible, as if the ship itself was emitting a low vibration, barely touching the air around it. They edged closer, their hearts pounding in their chests. There were no signs of life, no crew or passengers, nothing that could explain the craft's presence. Just this eerie object, sitting in the middle of the woods, untouched by the rain, as though waiting for something or someone. Before they could approach any closer, Michael suddenly felt a chill wash over him. A wave of dizziness struck him, and he staggered back, clutching Claire's arm for support. The next morning, when the rain had finally stopped, they returned to the spot where they had found the spacecraft. But it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. And yet, everything felt different. The air was heavier, as if the world itself had shifted ever so slightly. From that day on, Michael and Claire's lives changed in ways they couldn't explain. Strange occurrences began to follow them, flickers of light in the sky, odd sounds in the night, and dreams filled with images of that silent, forgotten spacecraft. But no matter how hard they tried, they could never shake the feeling that they were no longer alone. The rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour as Rachel navigated the winding country road. The storm had come out of nowhere, swirling in from the horizon in a wall of dark clouds, leaving her with little choice but to keep driving. The night was thick with the scent of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. The road was quiet, save for the roar of the storm and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the landscape in brief, stark bursts. Rachel's mind wandered as she gripped the steering wheel, the monotonous rhythm of the rain lulling her into a kind of trance. She had been driving for hours, trying to reach her sister's house before the storm worsened. But now, as the rain picked up speed, she found herself more concerned about getting through the storm safely. That's when it happened. A sudden flash of light cut through the storm, blinding her completely. It was so bright, so intense, that for a moment she couldn't see anything at all. Her heart slammed against her chest, her hands instinctively jerking the wheel. But she couldn't tell if the light was coming from the road, the sky, or something else entirely. The entire world seemed to be consumed by the flash, as though time had stopped, leaving her suspended in that piercing whiteness. It felt like an eternity before the light finally faded. Rachel blinked rapidly, her vision still swimming in spots as the world slowly came back into focus. The rain continued to pelt her car, but something had shifted. She felt it deep in her bones, a subtle but unmistakable change in the air around her. The road stretched out before her, unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. She glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone there. But the mirror reflected nothing out of the ordinary. The quiet hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of the rain, seemed as it had before. But a nagging feeling twisted in her stomach, a sensation that she was no longer alone, even if no one else was in sight. The flash of light had felt like a cosmic interruption, something not meant to be witnessed, and now she couldn't shake the sense that whatever she had just experienced was far more than an ordinary storm. Her fingers trembled on the wheel as she sped along, glancing nervously at the landscape, hoping to shake the unease crawling through her. It wasn't until she reached her sister's house hours later, the storm now a distant memory, that Rachel realized just how deeply her life had changed. She no longer felt like the person who had left earlier that evening. The flash of light, brief as it had been, had opened something inside her, a space where questions began to form, where an alien presence lingered in her thoughts. She would never look at the night sky the same way again. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the overwhelming sense that the world around her had shifted, just as subtly and irrevocably as the storm itself. The flash had shown her the truth, and now it would follow her forever. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the rain lashed against the house. The storm had rolled in quickly, its intensity increasing with every passing minute. Inside, Thomas sat by the window, a mug of tea in his hands, his thoughts drifting back to the night that had changed everything. A night very much like this one, stormy, wild, and alive with an electricity he would never forget. It had been years ago, yet it still felt like it happened only yesterday. He had been out in the fields, the thunder booming above as the rain fell in sheets. The clouds were heavy, the sky an inky black, except for the occasional jagged flash of lightning. He'd gone out to check the weather station, his mind focused on the task at hand. The air had felt thick, charged, as if the storm was preparing to unleash something beyond just rain. Then, just as the first thunderclap echoed across the land, he saw it. At first, he thought it was another flash of lightning, but the light didn't dissipate. It hovered, a soft glow, hovering in the sky like a star that refused to burn out. His heart skipped a beat as he watched, too mesmerized to move. The light grew, and then, without warning, a dark shape emerged from the clouds. It was nothing like an airplane or a helicopter. This thing was silent, moving with a fluidity that defied the laws of physics, darting through the storm with an ease he could scarcely comprehend. He should have run, he thought now. He should have turned and made for the safety of the house. but his legs felt rooted to the ground, and the light seemed to beckon him forward. It wasn't until the craft landed that he felt his feet begin to move on their own, drawn toward it as though by some invisible force. When the UFO touched down, it was as if the storm itself paused for a moment, holding its breath. The air was thick with energy, almost crackling, and then the hatch opened. Out of the craft stepped a figure. It wasn't like anything Thomas had ever seen, tall, slender, with skin that shimmered in the low light. The being regarded him quietly, its large, dark eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through him. It spoke then, though its voice didn't come through his ears. It was a telepathic message, direct and clear. "The future of humanity lies in your hands," it said. "The storm is a symbol, change is coming. Be ready." The being's words hung in the air long after it had vanished back into the ship, which disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. Thomas stood alone in the field, his heart pounding, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. He would never forget that night. The message had been clear, yet the weight of it, of knowing that humanity's future had already been set in motion, felt like a burden too heavy to bear. As the rain continued to pour outside, Thomas knew deep down that his life would never be the same. Something had shifted that night, something cosmic, and the truth had been delivered on the wings of a storm. The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking the small valley that had been quiet for years. It was the kind of rain that felt heavier than usual, almost unnatural in its persistence. The locals spoke of it with a sense of dread. Something about this particular storm, this never-ending downpour, felt different from any they had ever experienced. It wasn't just the weather that had changed, but the land itself seemed to shift under the weight of the water, as though the valley was caught in some otherworldly grip. Martha, an old widow who had lived in the valley for most of her life, noticed it first. The dreams. At first, they were faint, hazy images of strange landscapes, twisted metal structures, unfamiliar stars, and towering beings with eyes too large to be human. But the dreams grew more vivid, more real with each passing night. They became so detailed that she could swear she could hear their voices, could almost feel their presence standing in her room. She wasn't sure who or what they were, but she knew they were not from this world. Soon, other residents of the valley began to speak of similar dreams, dreams that seemed to pull them deeper into the mystery of the rain. Thomas, a young farmer, was the next to notice. As he worked his fields under the continuous downpour, he began hearing whispers in the wind. The sound was faint at first, like the wind itself was trying to speak, but then it became more distinct, almost like a voice calling to him from the clouds. One evening, when the rain was at its heaviest, he looked up and saw something in the sky, a streak of light that darted between the thick clouds, before disappearing just as quickly as it had come. He thought it might have been a trick of the storm, but deep down, he felt a strange sense of certainty. Something was watching them. The more the rain poured, the stranger the events became. A few miles away, old Rick, who'd always been skeptical of anything beyond the ordinary, started noticing figures in the fog. They appeared only at night, when the rain turned the valley into a mist-filled landscape. At first, he dismissed them as shadows or figments of his tired eyes, but when the figures started moving closer, he could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that something was happening. By the time the storms had reached their fourth week, the entire valley had fallen under a quiet, unsettling fear. The dreams, the whispers, and the strange figures all seemed tied to the rain. People had begun to wonder if the rain wasn't a natural occurrence at all. Could it be connected to something extraterrestrial? A signal, perhaps? Or an invitation from beings beyond the stars? Martha, unable to shake the feeling that the dreams were meant for her, decided to visit the old church at the edge of the valley. As she stepped inside, a deep hum filled the air, a vibration so subtle she almost missed it. She knew, then, that the answer was out there, hidden in the rain-soaked valley, waiting to be uncovered. The truth was coming. It was just a matter of time. The rain fell heavily, drumming against the canopy of trees in the dense woods. It was the kind of storm that seemed to stir up something in the air, thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Emily had always loved these kinds of nights, long walks through the forest, the rhythmic patter of rain acting as a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but there was an unusual stillness that seemed to hover over the woods, a silence that felt heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. She wandered deeper, her boots crunching softly against the wet leaves. As the wind howled through the branches above, she paused, sensing a strange pull toward a clearing ahead. The rain intensified, making everything feel even more surreal. It was in that moment, just as the wind seemed to shift in intensity, that she heard a low hum. It was faint at first, almost like an echo in her mind, but it grew stronger, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. She looked around, her heart beginning to race, searching for the source. Through the thick curtain of rain, she saw a light, soft at first, then blinding as it grew closer. Her instincts told her to run, to turn back, but something kept her rooted in place. The light was no longer just a glow. It had taken shape, a sleek, metallic craft hovering just above the ground. She could see it now, clearer than ever. The object was smooth, shaped like nothing she had ever seen before, its surface glimmering in the storm's light, as if reflecting an unknown, alien energy. The hum was now unmistakable, vibrating in her chest, pulling her in. And before she could even react, the ship descended slowly, its metallic doors opening with a soft hiss. The air was suddenly electric, filled with a silent power that made her heart pound in her chest. As she stepped closer, a sense of calm washed over her. The rain no longer felt cold. The world outside seemed distant. She could hear nothing but the hum of the ship, yet everything felt strangely familiar. Two figures appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. They were tall, their features obscured by the light, but their presence undeniable. They didn't speak, but Emily felt their message in her mind, not in words, but in impressions. Impressions of time, of observation, of a long-standing watch over Earth. They had been here for centuries, she understood, quietly monitoring, learning, waiting. Their eyes seemed to hold the depth of ages, and yet their gaze was gentle, as though they were offering her peace. Her body felt weightless as she was guided aboard the craft, the door closing softly behind her. She was not afraid, not anymore. The ship was alive with quiet energy, like it was breathing with her, responding to her every thought. There were no sharp edges, no fear, just a sense of knowing, as if she were part of something much larger than herself, something ancient and beyond comprehension. As the ship slowly rose above the ground, Emily gazed out at the rain-drenched forest, now shrinking beneath her. She realized then that this wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the culmination of something that had been quietly unfolding for millennia. The rain came down in torrents, drenching the hikers to the bone as they trudged along the mountain path. The air was thick with moisture, the world around them hazy, muffled by the storm. Each step felt heavier than the last, as the relentless downpour splashed against the jagged rocks beneath their feet. They had been caught off guard one minute. The sky had been clear. The next, it was as though a veil of water had descended from above. But something else was beginning to pull at them, something they couldn't explain. The group huddled together, trying to find shelter beneath the overhang of a rocky cliff, their clothes soaked, their breath visible in the cold air. Their leader, Sarah, was the first to notice it, a flicker in the clouds. It wasn't lightning, nor the flicker of a distant plane. No, this light was different, too controlled, too deliberate. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and without thinking, she pointed to the sky. "Look," she said. her voice barely above a whisper. The others followed her gaze. At first, it was just a bright pulse of light, far above the storm, hidden between the rolling clouds. Then, as if emerging from the depths of the rain itself, a shape began to form. It was too large to be a star, too still to be a plane. It hovered, suspended in the sky, like it had always been there, watching them. The light flickered again, brighter this time, casting strange shadows on the wet ground. And then came the sound. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, no crash of thunder, no roar of wind. Instead, it was a hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within them. It was as though the very air around them had become alive with energy. They could feel it, a wave of sound pulsing through their bodies, bypassing their ears entirely and directly into their minds. "Do you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "It's in my head." The others nodded, a mix of awe and fear washing over them. It was a message, clear and pure, carried on the frequency of the storm. No words, just impressions, feelings, flashes of images of distant worlds, of travelers from beyond, of time that stretched far beyond the human understanding of it. Their minds grasped at the sensation, but they couldn't fully comprehend it. It was more than a message. It was a connection, one that transcended language, culture, or history. For what felt like hours, the group stood there, rooted in the storm, as the craft loomed above, its light pulsating gently, almost rhythmically, as though it was breathing. The message it sent was profound, beyond what any of them had experienced. The sense of being part of something greater, a cosmic family watching and waiting, a shared history, a future unfolding. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faded. The craft lifted higher into the storm clouds, disappearing into the dark sky as the rain continued to pour. The world around them fell quiet, the vibrations dissipating, leaving only the sound of the rain to fill the air. They were left in silence, each of them changed, unsure of what had just occurred, but knowing without a doubt that it was real. Something had been communicated, something powerful, something that could never be forgotten. For as long as he could remember, Thomas had been fascinated by the sky. He'd spent countless nights staring at the stars, yearning for the strange and unexplained. His obsession with UFOs began when he was a child. Sitting on his front porch during a summer storm, the clouds had swirled ominously, casting a veil of darkness over the small town. That was when he saw it, a bright, silver disk darting across the horizon, cutting through the heavy rain with unnerving precision. No one else had seen it, and when he tried to explain, they dismissed it as a trick of the mind. But to Thomas, it was the beginning of something much greater. He'd since become a UFO hunter, combing the countryside in search of the truth. His trusty notebook, worn from years of use, was filled with entries about the strange lights he'd witnessed, the inexplicable patterns in the sky, and the close encounters that left him questioning everything. Stormy nights, it seemed, were the perfect conditions for these mysterious visitors. The rain, the thunder, the winds all seemed to draw them in, like a magnet pulling them closer. The latest storm had hit hard. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't just fall, it poured, drenching the earth in a steady rhythm, as if nature itself was in sync with the mysteries of the universe. Thomas had packed his gear, ready for the hunt. His car was parked at the edge of a darkened field, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. He'd learned long ago to trust the feeling, the pull that urged him forward, deeper into the unknown, the feeling that something was watching. Hours passed with nothing but the roar of the storm and the occasional flash of lightning. Just when he thought he'd been fooled once again, a strange movement caught his eye. A flicker of light, high above the storm, danced between the clouds. Thomas grabbed his binoculars, his heart racing. The object was unlike anything he'd ever seen, too fast, too controlled to be a mere weather phenomenon. He could feel his pulse quicken as it darted across the sky, leaving behind a faint, shimmering trail. He reached for his notebook, scribbling down notes, the words flowing faster than he could write. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the excitement. This was different, he could feel it in his bones. The UFO wasn't just passing by, it was circling, like it was observing him. The rain seemed to pause for a brief moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the object shot straight up into the clouds, disappearing without a trace. The storm returned to its full fury, but Thomas knew that tonight had been another step in his journey. It wasn't just a chance sighting or a fleeting moment. It was a message, one that only he had the privilege to receive. And though the truth still eluded him, he felt certain that the connection between him and the visitors from the stars was far deeper than he could ever explain. The diary continued to grow, each entry marking a chapter in a story that had no end. He was part of something greater, a silent witness to the skies. The rain had been relentless all evening, a constant pattering against the windows of the cabin by the lake. Sarah and her friends had come here to escape the noise of the world, to retreat into the quiet isolation of the forest. The flickering lights from the old wood stove cast dancing shadows on the walls as they shared stories of their childhoods, their lives. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling and the trees bending under its force. It was then that the lights appeared. At first, Sarah thought it was just a trick of the storm. The rain and lightning could play strange games with the eyes, but these lights, bright, almost blinding, seemed too intentional, too controlled. They hovered just above the surface of the lake, casting ripples of light across the water. For a moment, the storm seemed to fade into the background, as though the lights had demanded the universe's attention. "Do you see that?" one of Sarah's friends whispered, as if not speaking it aloud would make it go away. Sarah turned toward the window. The lights, like orbs of liquid gold, shimmered in the distance, their soft glow reflecting in the water. They moved, not in the random way of lightning, but with purpose. Sarah could feel the air around her shift, a strange, electric sensation crawling over her skin, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. The others were silent now, transfixed by the sight, but Sarah felt something more. The lights were calling to her, tugging at something deep inside. Almost without thinking, she grabbed her jacket, pulled it on, and stepped out into the downpour. The rain hit her face in sharp, icy bursts, but she barely felt it. She walked, drawn to the lake, as if the lights themselves were guiding her. With every step, the world around her seemed to grow quieter, more distant. The sound of the storm faded, replaced by an odd, almost imperceptible hum that resonated deep within her chest. Her friends called after her, but their voices sounded muffled, as if the air itself was thickening around her. When she reached the water's edge, the lights were so close now she could feel their warmth, a strange, calming heat in the middle of the storm. She stood, mesmerized, as the lights seemed to converge on her, surrounding her in a halo of gold. A soft voice, not heard with the ears but with her mind, whispered in her thoughts, but the words didn't make sense. Still, she felt them in her very soul, comforting, familiar, though she couldn't explain why. The trance-like state lasted only moments, but when Sarah finally stepped back, the lights were gone, leaving only the relentless sound of the storm behind. She turned back to the cabin, her mind racing. The others were waiting, their faces filled with concern. But Sarah knew that something had changed. Her perspective on everything, the world, her life, and even her place in it had shifted. She would never forget the lights over the lake. Their meaning, their message, remained a mystery. But Sarah knew, deep down, that she had touched something far beyond the confines of Earth. The rain fell in sheets, the sound of it tapping against the car windows, a constant hum. Hannah and Jack had been driving for hours, hoping to make it to the cabin by the lake before the storm got any worse. The road, winding and narrow, was almost empty, save for a few scattered streetlights flickering in the downpour. They had been looking forward to this trip for weeks' time to unwind, to get away from the stresses of work and life. But now, as they drove deeper into the storm, something felt different. Hannah glanced over at Jack, who was concentrating on the road ahead. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm not sure," he muttered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "I keep feeling like we're being watched." Hannah furrowed her brow, scanning the dark road behind them. There was nothing but rain and shadows. "What do you mean?" she asked, but before Jack could answer, something caught their attention in the mirror. A series of faint, shifting lights. At first it seemed like headlights of another car, but the lights weren't right, too bright, too erratic, and they didn't follow the patterns of normal traffic. The lights hovered, almost as if they were moving at the same speed they were, keeping pace with the car without any sign of slowing down or speeding up. "Jack, do you see that?" Hannah's voice was tight, her breath quickening. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened even further. He didn't answer at first, only stared ahead, clearly unsettled. The lights were no longer just behind them, they were now visible in the side mirrors, to the left and right, flickering like distant stars, but moving unnaturally fast. "Yeah," he whispered. "I see it." The silence in the car seemed to deepen, as if the world around them was holding its breath. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he checked the mirrors again. The lights were still there, but now they were circling them, weaving around the car, always at a distance, but close enough to feel their presence. It wasn't just their eyes, they felt the weight of the lights in their very bones, the odd, uncomfortable sensation of being scrutinized. "Should we stop?" Hannah asked, her voice strained. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know why, but something about those lights made her feel as if they were being examined. Jack didn't answer. He was frozen, staring out of the windshield. The lights had stopped circling and were now directly in front of them, hanging motionless in the sky, glowing faintly against the stormy backdrop. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched, helplessly, as the lights lingered. And then, without warning, the lights began to move again, retreating into the rain as silently as they had appeared. The storm raged on, but now, the road ahead seemed far more unsettling than before. Neither Hannah nor Jack said a word for the rest of the drive, but both of them knew deep down that their world had changed. They had been chosen for something they just didn't understand what. The storm had come out of nowhere, the kind of thunderstorm that turned the evening sky into a chaotic whirl of clouds and crackling energy. Jake stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain lash against the glass, his thoughts distant, drifting back to a time many years ago. A time when he was just a boy, standing outside with his father, watching the same storm clouds swirl above them. But that night had been different. That night, a strange light had appeared, cutting through the dark like a knife. He had never forgotten it. Jake had been only 10, too young to fully comprehend what he had seen, but old enough to know it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. A massive UFO, its shape unmistakable, hovering above their small farmhouse, casting a cold blue glow over the yard. He and his father had watched in stunned silence as the craft moved impossibly fast across the sky, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had arrived. The questions that followed had haunted him for years. What was it? Why had it come? Was it a message? Now, standing in his own kitchen years later, the storm felt strangely familiar, a déjà vu that tugged at the edges of his mind. He could almost feel the presence of that same craft, as if it had been waiting for him all this time, waiting for him to finally understand. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the door, his breath quickening. There it was, just as it had been all those years ago. A light in the distance, moving silently above the treetops, gliding effortlessly through the storm. His pulse raced, his hands trembling as he stepped outside, the rain soaking through his clothes. The storm was wild, but the light remained calm, hovering just above the horizon, its brilliance cutting through the chaos. It was the same craft. Jake felt a surge of emotion, fear, awe, and something else, something deeper. He had wondered for years whether he had imagined it all as a child, but standing there, watching the light grow brighter, he knew it had always been real. This wasn't a trick of his mind. He had been marked, and now it had returned. The craft moved closer, its lights more intense now, its form clearer against the dark backdrop of the storm. Jake stood frozen, unable to look away, the questions of his childhood rising once more. But this time, as the craft hovered directly above him, he felt no fear, only a deep sense of peace. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would finally make sense. The lights flickered once more, and then without a sound the craft moved away, retreating into the night. Jake watched as it disappeared, and in that instant, he understood. It wasn't just about the craft or the lights, it was about the connection. The answers he had searched for were never meant to come from the outside world. They were always within him, waiting to be realized. And now, after all these years, he finally knew the truth. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter, the heavy downpour from earlier now just a distant memory. The clouds, once thick and suffocating, had begun to part, letting the first hints of moonlight filter through. The world felt different, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dirt from the earth. It was as though the rain had swept through the very fabric of time itself, leaving a quiet stillness in its wake. Jake sat by the window, watching the landscape outside transform in the soft glow of the moon. The world seemed so calm now, the air crisp and clean, a peaceful contrast to the chaos of the storm. The wind had died down, leaving only the rustling of wet leaves in its place. The trees swayed gently, their branches no longer whipped by the violent gusts that had come before. It felt like the earth itself was taking a deep breath, exhaling a sigh of relief. His mind wandered, his thoughts drifting back to the encounter that had just taken place. The craft, the light, the connection, it all felt so surreal now, as if the storm had somehow brought him closer to the truth he had been seeking all his life. But there was more. The questions that had plagued him since he was a child still lingered, unanswered but not unimportant. What was the purpose of their visits? What did they want with humanity? And, perhaps most importantly, why had it taken so long for them to show themselves again? A soft breeze passed through the open window, the cool air brushing against his face. For the first time in years, Jake felt at peace with the mysteries that surrounded him. The answers might not be clear yet, but he knew the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps humanity wasn't ready to fully understand, but the possibility of something greater was enough to hold on to. Maybe, just maybe, the time would come when the truth would be revealed. As the night stretched on, and the storm finally came to an end, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him. He could hear the faint chirping of crickets, a sound that seemed almost foreign after the tumultuous roar of the rain. The world had returned to normal, but something within him had shifted. He no longer felt like a passive observer of the strange and unexplainable. He was part of it, connected to something far beyond the limits of his understanding. With the last remnants of the storm fading away, Jake stood up and walked outside, gazing up at the sky. The stars were clearer now, their distant light twinkling down at him, a reminder that there was more to the universe than he could ever comprehend. The calm after the storm was a peaceful one, but it was also a quiet invitation. If extraterrestrial life truly existed, then perhaps they were watching, waiting for the right moment to step forward. And maybe, just maybe, that moment would come sooner than anyone could ever imagine.